The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We are still waiting for some people to join. We will be with you in a few minutes. Hi, everybody again. Thank you very much for your patience. Welcome to all. Good morning for those who participate from America. Good afternoon to those who are in Europe and Africa. And good evening, or even later, for those who participate in Asia. Renewables 2019 is IEA's flagship publication on renewables forecasts. This is published every year. For those who are following us in the past knows this, but for those who are joining the webinar for the first time, we publish this report every year. It covers the forecast for the next 5 years for 3 sectors: electricity, transport, and heat. We published the report last week on Monday officially. Probably you saw the news. It's covered by more than 100 journals or online media outlets, and we have today a record level of participants to this webinar. Thank you, all of you, for your interest. You will be able to ask questions by typing to the question screen. We will be able to see your questions. I will be reading them out and basically moderating the session. My name is Sami Bahar. I am the senior analyst and the project lead of the IEA Renewable Energy Forecast and work on policies. And there are multiple colleagues who will be speaking throughout the webinar. I will make the transitions. And sorry if we cannot answer all of your questions because there are about now 220 people online, but we will come back to you in written and you will be able to see our official email at the end of the presentation. I would like to start with electricity. As I said, the report covers 3 sectors, and we will go through the renewable electricity. And I would like to mention that this year we focused on distributed solar PV. You will be able to see some of the in-depth analysis that we did on distributed PV throughout the webinar under this section. I'd like to start with our last year's forecast. We always compare the performance of countries year on year. Last year we forecasted about 1,100 gigawatts of renewable electricity capacity coming online. These include all technologies, large hydro, small hydro, PV, wind, CSP, geothermal, bioenergy, and marine technologies. Last year, we revised, as I said, around 1,100 gigawatts. This year, we revised up our forecast by 14%. In almost all regions and countries, with one important exception. There are also other exceptions, but one important exception was Sub-Saharan Africa. My colleague Carolina will come back to that later in the webinar, why we revised it down. But the main reason is on the screen, financial risks and administrative and policy uncertainties. In terms of the ranking and top countries, actually, top leaders did not change year on year. China remains simply the 40% of all capacity that will come online, followed by European Union, which has a big revision, which will come back later, United States and India. Those countries account the significant majority of our forecast. Together, these are the largest markets. The biggest revisions are from China and the European Union, and then we will come back to those later on during the presentation. So I would like to start with the biggest country, China. As you may know, China's renewable policy is transitioning very fast. And there are 2 reasons about this transition. The first one is the subsidy challenge. Renewable subsidies have been a burden to the financial ministry, and they've been announcing this, that they will change the policy to go towards more competitive auctions. And then this is happening right now. It's happening in 2019. This is reflected in our forecast. The second challenge is grid integration, and the new policy of competitive auctions and warning and banning mechanism in places where the curtailment is high is basically promoting a sustainable growth of renewables in China. Historically, Chinese renewable energy market was dominated by hydropower, but this shift already happened towards wind and solar in 2015, 16, I will say. Last year, we had an interesting development where solar PV market slowed down in China significantly because of the policy shift. We expect a continuous slowdown in 2019 and a stable growth of wind and solar throughout the forecast period. The reason why we expect stable growth, because the policies promote stable growth. There are 2 important developments. One, as I mentioned, the competitive auctions, which makes an emergence of subsidy-free projects that are basically accepting provincial electricity prices. But there are also those who participate in auctions, both distributed PV, utility-scale PV, onshore wind, who are basically simply bidding lower and lower prices closer to the provincial benchmark prices. These are good developments for the industry, and we expect a growth which is sustainable. 2020 is an important year for China. We expect the highest wind capacity coming online because feed-in tariffs are phasing out. From now on, we will expect a sustainable growth. The important growth will also come from distributed PV. As you can see, that it's creates the largest growth among all technologies in 2024 annual additions. The reason behind it is that we expect industrial and large commercial applications to lead the growth because there are savings on their bills because of the current cost of PV versus the retail electricity prices. One policy-driven market is also United States. Every year we say this, that U.S. growth is driven by policy ups and downs and changes and schedules. This year, this remains the same. We revised up the forecast for the United States only for one reason, because of we expected that tariffs for solar PV modules will have a larger impact on prices. However, with the supply glut in China, because of the lower demand, prices of modules went down, and then basically the impact was not that high and will not be that high in the future. I would like to show you policy ups and downs in the United States, which you can guess the forecast afterwards. In 2007-12, we had a big wind boom due to the extension of PTC. Then slowly it was back up. 2016, we had a PV boom, again because of the scheduled extension of the PV ITC. And then we had, again, coming back up with a larger scale. And we expect in 2020 a wind boom. The reason behind this, because again, a phase out of the tax incentives, which requires all projects to come online by 2020. This creates this. And beyond that, our forecast assumes there will be no PTC for wind. So as you can see, the annual additions slow down significantly. On the other hand, the schedule for ITC project commissioning is different. That's why you will see an increasing additions up to 2024, which is reaching a record level compared to historical levels. In addition to that, tax incentives which dictate the ups and downs in the forecast, we also have extended state RPS and corporate PPAs, which remain a significant growth factor in the US forecast, and it will remain a significant growth factor. India is a complicated market. Unfortunately, this year our India forecast remained similar to last year because we did not see a major improvement in challenges. Despite these challenges and stable forecasts, annual additions in India increased by 50% in 2022 compared to 2018 levels, which is a very good development. However, the situation remains problematic because of few reasons. The first one is auction cancellations and capacity reductions and under subscriptions in the auctions, which has actually increased last year, these cancellations and renegotiations of the contract. We have still a weak grid infrastructure, causes connection challenges and delays. This comes in India. Local distribution companies who are the buyers of renewable energy products are financially not very healthy. Although government policies try to improve this, it remains still a challenge. State-level implementation of the portfolio standards compared to expectations of the central government remain disconnected. Also, rooftop PV sector is going very slow because of administrative and policy challenges in place, although we may see an important growth in the coming 5 years. Lastly, affordable financing remains an important factor. Now I would like to move to the few other important regions. Please, Carolina, the floor is yours.
So first of all, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jaime, for passing. So as Jaime has mentioned, we would like to move now to discuss the renewable energy development in other regions, in particular in MENA, Latin America, Eurasia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and I will start from discussing MENA. So this year, forecast has been revised up by 25% to reflect a more optimistic outlook for solar PV, resulting from new auctions planned in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Norway. This trend was triggered largely by the increasing cost effectiveness of solar PV, owing to a combination of good resource potential across these countries, as well as availability of affordable financing and competitive bidding that is implemented in several countries of the region, which continues to produce some of the lowest tariffs in the world. Last year, in the region, prices around $23 and $28 have been cleared through auctions, which is an interesting outcome. Overall, region is to add 30 gigawatt capacity in the next 5 years, meaning that MENA's total installed renewable capacity is going to double by 2024, reaching nearly 60 gigawatts by 2024. And now moving to Latin America. This year we note a slower than anticipated progression in hydropower, mainly due to smaller hydropower project pipeline in Brazil, as economically viable sites for large projects are limited and the costs are increasing in order to address social and environmental impacts. Despite the hydropower slowdown, Brazil continues to lead the region, growing with growth bringing over 40% of the total regional renewable growth, followed by Argentina and Chile. We see outside of the hydropower, we see a more optimistic outlook for other technologies, in particular for solar PV and onshore wind, driven by auctions, various forms of self-generation frameworks adopted in countries across the region. And additionally, we anticipate an increase of projects coming online through corporate power purchase agreements. Additionally, I would like to add that in Brazil, outside of the auction system, we see an increasing pipeline of wind projects that are going to sell electricity on a spot market. Moving to Eurasia. While forecast for hydropower remains unchanged for this particular region, growth for other renewables really gains momentum in Eurasia, in particular for onshore wind and solar PV, and this is driven by feed-in tariffs, as well as increasing adoption of capacity auction across the region. In 2018 alone, Albania, Armenia, and Kazakhstan completed the first auction round, with PV prices averaging at $58 per megawatt hour and onshore wind clearing at $53. Ukraine just adopted auction system in addition to its feed-in tariffs, and the two schemes will operate in parallel until the phase-out of the FIT in 2030. Ukraine is alone expected to bring nearly half of the regional renewable growth, which is an impressive growth. Due to adopted framework, strong commitment of the government to renewables, and industry interest in the market. In addition, a number of countries in Eurasia are currently working or adopting net metering policies as we speak. And also, international financing institutions are also increasing their presence in the region, which improves the cost effectiveness and provides access to soft loans for projects in the region. Overall, Eurasia is to grow by nearly 20 gigawatts, passing 100 gigawatt mark, with Ukraine leading the growth. For Sub-Saharan Africa, renewable energy resources availability push towards a higher electrification rate. Viable options for fuel switching for primary and backup generation continue to be a very strong driver in the region, as well with countries setting up renewable energy targets for on-grid capacity and for the off-grid. We also see increased policy adoption and a presence of internationally backed financing programs that support the growth. However, the expansion is limited due to the number of factors, and that is the policy instability, often lack of the horizon over the future auction timelines. If there's auction in a particular country, the auction processes take long time. It takes long time to sign power purchase agreements. Instability of the off-taker, we see that being a problem across various of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Limited access to financing is also problematic, and to affordable financing. Untimely grid arrival is continue to be a barrier, along with limits in local infrastructure to support large scale project development, such as, for example, lack of the road network. Additionally, administrative barriers such as complex and unclear administrative procedures continue to be problematic, and there's often problems with land acquisition. Overall, Sub-Saharan Africa is to grow by 22 gigawatts to reach just over 60 by the end of the forecast, led by Ethiopia, South Africa, and Kenya. And now, while we're talking about Africa, I would like to divert for a moment to an important topic for the developing countries, which is the development in off-grid PV installations. So in addition to tracking deployment of on-grid renewables, our report also tracks sales in off-grid solar sales levels for industrial, commercial, and solar home systems for the residential usage above 8 watt size, and we translated to capacity-based growth over the next 5 years. And so the Renewables 2019 report expects off-grid segments to add around 4 gigawatt capacity over the next 5 years, spread across these 3 segments that I have just mentioned in developing Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa regions together. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, off-grid solar PV is estimated to bring 20% of the total PV growth, which is an important number, and just over 5% of the total renewable expansion over the next 5 years. This growth is a direct result of countries working on increasing their electrification rates. Nevertheless, the private sector activity is pivotal for bringing the off-grid PV to the regions, using new business models for operation and unlocking new groups of customers and access to various sizes of solar home systems. Kenya is a regional leader in off-grid business innovation, with private sector having a strong presence. But additionally, the government launched various programs to support financing of the off-grid installations. In developing Asia, the growth is led by India and Bangladesh, adding water pumps for agriculture purposes, and that is driven by governmental policies. And now, overall, the off-grid solar home systems are to provide, over the next 5 years, nearly 80 million people with initial access to electricity services. As we can see on the right-hand side figure, pool of customers is benefiting from smaller range of kits is important. However, growing number of customers invest in large size of the kits, as companies working in the region offer larger kits in pay-as-you-go systems. And now I would like to pass to conclude my part and pass to my colleague Yasmina, who will discuss distributed solar PV.
Before we get to distributed PV, first we'll just take a look at the European forecast. And this year, Europe's renewable capacity is expected to increase by 1/3. Solar PV is expected to lead that growth, which is evenly distributed between utility scales and distributed PV. Second largest growth is going to be from onshore wind, followed by offshore wind, with additions from bioenergy and hydropower. As Jaime mentioned earlier, Europe is the region that accounts for the largest upward revision in absolute terms. So overall, the European forecast is revised up by almost half. The largest upward revisions are coming from utility PV, distributed PV, and onshore wind. And the reason for that is for utility scale plants, we see more optimistic growth driven by new policies that give a longer term visibility over the support for renewables. And that's going to take the form either of countries adding more competitive auctions over a longer period of time, but also higher targets post-2020. For distributed PV, the more optimistic outlook is coming from an increasing economic attractiveness, in part due to stronger growth we've seen in 2018 in major markets, stronger growth than we estimated previously due to falling investment costs, but also because we see policy changes in key markets over the next 5 years that we expect to further improve the business case for self-consumption. And seeing where those markets in Europe are that we see the growth, typically the main leaders. So we expect Germany to lead the forecast with the highest growth, followed by Spain, France, Netherlands, Turkey, the UK. Together, those markets combined account for about 2/3 of the European growth, another third from other markets, such as Italy, Poland, Sweden, and Belgium. Taking a closer look at Germany, important to note that this year the forecast for Germany is revised up due to a more optimistic outlook for solar PV, and that offsets the more pessimistic outlook for onshore wind. Over the last year in Germany, 2 major policies have been announced or proposed that drive this more optimistic outlook. And first is the Omnibus Energy Act, which announced the introduction of these additional auctions for utility scale PV and wind, but also the recent climate plan, which proposes to extend support for distributed PV beyond the cap of 52 gigawatts cumulative installed capacity. But these two changes are what drives the more optimistic outlook for solar PV, but not necessarily for onshore wind, where permitting challenges are slowing down the development of onshore wind there, longer lead times, and decommissioning rates of older turbines are a risk factor for growth and a key forecast uncertainty. Spain is the market that has the highest upward revision, and that's also due to the introduction of new policies. The new climate plan introduces ambitious 2030 targets and proposes to have about 3 gigawatts of utility scale auctions per year. We also see regulatory changes to distributed PV that we expect to make it more economically attractive, both on the commercial side and on the residential side, where we see remuneration for excess generation for the first time. In France, the forecast is also revised up due to the introduction of a new 10-year plan and higher capacity targets for renewable energy with additional auctions. And we also expect strong growth in Netherlands, particularly due to solar PV, due to the advantageous economics under net metering and the increasing competitiveness of PV versus other technologies within the auction framework there. Interesting to note is the sixth largest market, the UK, has a different profile compared to the rest of the markets, and that 70% of its growth is expected to come from offshore wind. So that summarizes our regional forecast. If we turn back to looking at a global view, and we look at that global view by technology, our forecast expects that renewable capacity will expand by 50% by 2024. We expect solar PV to lead that growth, accounting for about 60% of all renewable capacity expected to come online over the forecast period. We expect that to be followed by onshore wind, hydropower, offshore wind, bioenergy, and other technologies. And if we take a closer look at solar PV, as Jaime had mentioned earlier, hinted to earlier, we expect that half that growth is expected to come from distributed PV systems. And these are systems, the use of their technology by households, industries, and businesses that are used to generate their own electricity. Currently, right now, distributed PV makes up about 40% of the current installed solar PV capacity. And because of this prevalence, it's one of the reasons why, or the main reason why, we chose to make it a special focus of this year's report. So over the forecast period, you can see that we've got about 300 gigawatts of distributed PV we expect to come online, and that's roughly the same amount as the second bar right above it, onshore wind. So that's just to point out that the role of distributed PV is expected to be quite significant over the next 5 years. And we expect it to be much more significant than we've seen in the past, because the growth over the next 5 years, from 2019 to 2024, is expected to be more than twice the growth that we had in the previous 5-year period. Another interesting trend to note is where that growth is actually happening. So in the past, we saw that most of the distributed PV growth was located in key markets, mostly in the European Union, then spreading out to China, the United States, and Japan. But now, over the next 5 years, we see growth spreading out to newer markets, as we see, well, growth led by China, followed by EU, US, Japan, but now we see the emergence of India. Australia, we expect some growth, but also interesting to note is this other country segment at the end. So now we see distributed growth spreading out to newer markets, such as Latin America, and particularly Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, Southeast Asia, and MENA. Now, when we're talking about distributed PV, we normally tend to group those into 3 main segments. The first is off-grid, and those represent systems either in rural areas or in agriculture that are located off of the main grid or not connected to the grid actually at all and need electricity access. The second segment that we group distributed PV into is the residential segment, and those are smaller systems up to about 10 kilowatts located on your home. And the third one is commercial systems, and these are larger than residential, up to about 1 megawatt, located or used by businesses, industries, or public entities. And it's actually this last segment, the commercial segment, that is actually the largest segment of distributed PV. Right now, it accounts for about 2/3 of today's distributed PV capacity. And we expect that segment to lead the forecast growth of distributed PV in the sense that 75% of the distributed PV growth over the next 5 years is expected to be from the commercial segment. And the reason for this is because this segment has a stronger business case than the other two segments. First of all, because of the economies of scale. So these larger systems can take advantage of economies of scale and have lower investment costs, which ultimately lead to lower generating costs and makes it much more attractive to generate your own electricity rather than paying electricity from the grid. And then these systems, these commercial systems can do that more often because they have a better match between the PV output and electricity demand. And what that does is then they can have higher amounts of self-consumption and ultimately save more on their electricity bills in the case of residential. So this driver, because of this dynamic, actually, we expect more growth to come from commercial systems than we do in residential systems in most markets, which is what you're seeing here. So for most of the markets on this graph here, you see that there's more growth in the commercial segment than the residential segment. Except in the case of North America, which is largely due to the United States, you see higher growth here we expect from the residential segment than we do in the commercial segment. In part, that is due to the fact that commercial segment in the United States has had a few more challenges, partially because of the lower electricity prices for commercial have made a less compelling business case than in residential, but also financing for the commercial systems has been a bit more complex and less accessible than residential. That's not to say, though, that we expect robust growth for the residential systems in North America, in the United States, partially also due to the fact that California's new mandate for requiring PV to be installed on all new buildings from 2020 onwards. So robust growth in distributed PV expected. If you add all this up, we expect China to surpass Europe as the region that has the most distributed PV by 2024. So these are the trends in distributed PV, and if we dig a little bit deeper in terms of what's driving those, economics and policy, I'll let Hammy explain those.
So there are two main drivers of distributed PV in most of the countries. Obviously, we don't compare the competitiveness or economic attractiveness of distributed PV applications based on a wholesale price, but at a retail price, as people do savings on their bills based on retail price. So as you can see, we give some of the examples of the residential retail price in some countries and comparing them with today's or last year's levelized cost of energy range. As you can see already today, in many parts of the world, retail prices are much higher compared to the LCO in 2018, which means that consumers today, when they install this PV application, depending on the policy, they will save money on their bills. Obviously, this doesn't necessarily mean that they will do the installation, but it means that they may start saving money. And while we don't forecast residential electricity prices, we do forecast LCOEs for distributed PV, and obviously we expect continuous cost reductions, 15 to 35%, depending on the country, making even countries such as China and India, where the residential electricity prices are extremely low, starting at a level where equal to the retail prices, if retail prices remain the same. We did this analysis for many more countries, and then the result, it looks similar by 2024 for both developing countries and obviously developed countries is already the case today. When you look at the policies, driving policies, we have divided the policies into three major categories. These are Biodiesel models, which is classical feed-in tariff. You generate everything and you sell to the grid, and you buy everything back from the grid. The other one is net metering, where we will see a credit acquisition for a different time of the year or a day or a month through the policy. This is the second one. And the other one is real-time self-consumption models, where you self-consume on real-time, you send to the grid real-time, and we categorize them under three subcategories where you get how much money you get for your excess generation. And the picture looks different for residential and commercial sectors. For residential sectors, Biodiesel model leads because of China, but beyond that, net metering is still a large policy that drives the growth. Slowly, countries are switching to value-based remuneration on the real-time self-consumption. And for commercial, already as the match between supply and demand is much more prevalent, they can self-consume more of their electricity, and governments realize this, and there are not much net metering policies on the commercial level, but mostly real-time self-consumption models. And the picture is different by region, as you can see in the right-hand side. I'm not going to explain in more detail, but North America and Latin America today is dominated by net metering schemes. The other regions is a mixture of policies. One important thing to mention, of course, the more people self-consume, the less they pay to the grid. And when you look at your bill, you will see four main components. One is energy, the other one is transmission and distribution charges, levies and surcharges. These can be renewable charges, electricity taxes, special taxes, whatever you can imagine, and VAT. And when you look at how much utilities will lose because of this, we try to calculate and break down the bills on more than 30 countries, and then match that with our forecast, and then based on 25 to 75 of contractual self-consumption. First, obviously, the energy price, which actually represents the majority of these of the bill component, can be about 7 per year in 2024. But the most important price is actually T&D. Why T&D? Because T&D are fixed assets, but in many countries we are paying them as variable charges on our bills. The less people pay, the less grid is compensated, and there needs to be a balance between how the grid is compensated among customers. Levies and surcharges and VAT are also added on top, which affects the government revenues, obviously. In the end, the exponential growth of distributed PV requires a new approach, because this is a new way of generating and consuming electricity, and new policies and market reports will be needed to balance the opposing interests between distributed PV owners, energy companies, and electricity consumers in general. And one last point on if we are on track or not. Obviously, our main case forecast, I read the questions that are coming, are not on track with global climate goals. It falls short for the electricity sector. But despite this, generation growth between different fuels in the next 5 years is significantly dominated by solar PV and wind, as you can see, much larger than natural gas and coal. However, still the share of renewables remain just about 30%, while coal remains the largest source of generation by 2024, while two other fuels such as nuclear and natural gas remain stable. So we have an accelerated case basically which is in line with the global climate goals, and there are three major challenges that holds countries to go towards the accelerated case. These are grid integration, policy uncertainty, and financial challenges. And government can accelerate this by addressing these challenges in countries which we mentioned previously. Our accelerated is 26% larger than the main case. And where is it coming from? Majority is from China, Asia Pacific, and Europe and North America. I would like to highlight Middle East and North Africa here, which has a large potential. However, although we improve the forecast, the untapped potential remains. And we will see in those policy developments go. On the other hand, in terms of the technology breakdown, utility and distributed PV are also the largest component of the accelerated case, and followed by hydropower, and followed by wind and hydropower, and you can see also bioenergy, which is a important generation component in our forecast. On this note, I would like to conclude the electricity part and move on to transport, and Faro will continue on the transport slides.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so I'm going to talk about renewable transport. So just looking here at the bar on the left-hand side, you can see from the red dot that the renewable share in transport was around 3.7% last year. Most of this came from biofuels, as you can see, with the remainder renewable electricity. Now, over our forecast, we actually expect in energy terms renewable energy and transport to grow around 30%. The biofuel share from that will still be over 90% by the end of the forecast. And of the renewable electricity, we anticipate around 2/3 of that will be from electric rail in transport, but we do see renewable electricity in road transport growing as well, as the electric car fleet in particular grows from around 5 million last year to maybe potentially 40 million by the end of the forecast. Now, looking at the renewable share of transport, though, you can still see it's still below 5%. So let's compare that to what Hamie said in one of the preceding slides with electricity reaching 30%. So transport is really lagging behind into getting renewables. And why does that renewable share grow so little? If we move over to the right-hand side, we can see there that's indexed fuel demand growth. If we look at the black line, that's the global average. So fossil transport fuel demand is still growing. What is driving that? If we look at the growth in India, China, in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Asean, you can see this is propelling growth up, population growth, economic growth, higher levels of vehicle ownership, for example, and also aviation travel. And that's offsetting the efficiency gains you see, for example, in North America and Europe. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the forecast last year. So global biofuel production increased by 10 billion liters last year. So that was a 7% increase year on year, which was the highest for 5 years. So ethanol accounted for around 2/3 of that increase. And of that, Brazil was 60% of the annual growth. And that was from a combination of higher oil prices through most of the year, combined with low international sugar prices that meant ethanol was more competitive at the pump. So consumption was up and production was up because mills favored ethanol over sugar generally. The next biggest contributors to the ethanol growth were from the United States and India, which accounted for around 15% each. Now, 1/3 of the overall biofuels growth was from biodiesel and hydrotreated vegetable oil, or HVO, as we will call it. And most of that growth was led by the United States. A key driver here was the anti-dumping duties it introduced on imports from Indonesia and Argentina, which boosted domestic production and also policy support. And around 1/4 of the growth was from Brazil, where its biodiesel mandate increased to 10%. So moving over to the right, we can see the total biofuel production last year was around 154 billion liters. We expect our forecast production to grow by about 25% to 2024 to reach 190 billion liters. That is an upward revision of our forecast. And now what I'm going to do is break down how that looks by fuel and by country and region. So when we talk about the total biofuel production, this is dominated by the United States and Brazil. So last year they provided around 70% of all output. But the forecast picture is a lot more diverse, and overall we expect Asia to provide half of growth. So China, for the first time, leads our forecast. This is mainly due to a tripling of ethanol production, as we really start to see concrete measures in the country towards moving up consumption in line with its 10% ethanol blending nationwide. The next highest growth is from the Asean region. You can see that's dominated by biodiesel, and the biggest driver there is Indonesia's drive to scale up domestic consumption of biodiesel, not just in transport, but also across its whole economy, so in industry, in power generation as well. Then we see Brazil. So by individual country, it's the second largest growth, mainly from ethanol. Key drivers for biofuel production growth in Brazil are the introduction of its new Renova Bio policy, we expect next year, which should improve the economics of biofuel production, and also a steady increase in the biodiesel mandate from 10% potentially due to up to 15%, although that depends on vehicle testing. Next up is the USA. We can see most growth there is actually from biodiesel and HVO via support from the Renewable Fuel Standard and also California's low carbon fuel standard. For India, we actually expect this year, for the first time, it will meet its 5% ethanol blending mandate and actually maybe pass it towards 6%. and positive measures for ethanol in its 2018 biofuels policy underpin growth. While in the EU it's a bit more diverse, we expect some growth in HVO to offset a slight decline in biodiesel. The reason for the slight decline is because what we are seeing is biodiesel is supported by mandate policies with a certain share of demand. Overall, the increasing efficiency of the vehicle fleet means that the share of demand under the mandate is lower, and we're also seeing a lower share of diesel vehicles in new vehicle registrations. So now we look at security of supply, which is a bit of analysis we did. So China, India, and Indonesia account for 40% of the production growth in our forecast. And improving security of supply is a key driver for the biofuels policies in these countries. So let's have a look at the table on the left so we can really analyze the security of supply situation. So we can see in terms of oil import dependency, they are all heavily dependent on imports, particularly the situation is most acute in India. Then we go down to oil demand growth, which is underpinned largely by transport. And we can see that India, well, in all three countries, oil demand grows strongly. And then we consider oil production. And for example, while in India this grows, not enough to meet the higher demand. And it also production declines in China and Indonesia. So all countries here have introduced biofuels mandates. So we already mentioned China's E10 objective to have nationwide 10% ethanol blending. Indonesia has a 20% mandate now for biodiesel and aims to increase this to 30%, pending vehicle testing. And in India, as I said, it had a 5% mandate now, but by 2030, it would like to go to 20% ethanol. So we can see on the right-hand side, the higher share of domestic fuel supply of diesel and of gasoline. So diesel in Indonesia with B20 and gasoline in China and Indonesia with 10% ethanol blending that would be achieved from these policies. And this would also support national trade balances. So in China's, that would improve by $5 billion per year, and in Indonesia and India, it would improve by around $1 billion per year. Now, for the first time, we did a forecast for HVO, which in North America is known as renewable diesel. And this was to really reflect the more important role it's playing in biofuels markets. So we can see on the left-hand side, HVO production grows as much as biodiesel over our forecast, although as shown by the red dot, its share in production at the end of the forecast is still lower. And then we're moving over to the right-hand side, we can see that we see production growing from around 5.5 billion liters last year to more than double to 13 billion liters. Most of that growth is in Europe and the United States with favorable policies. And what this does, this reflects $5 billion of investment in new capacity, mostly new plants, but as you can see, there's a big share of that growth from the conversion of fossil refineries to produce HVO. Now, what's driving that growth? There's a few technical factors that support HVO use. First of all, it's less constrained by blend limits, so the percentage you can blend with a fossil fuel than other biofuels, so it's known as a drop-in fuel. It has lower air pollutant emissions than diesel and good cold start properties. And importantly, it offers high-value co-products. So a HVO refinery wouldn't only produce HVO, it can produce renewable propane, naphtha, and chemicals, and also co-production of HEFA jet fuel, biojet fuel from the same facilities. And one final slide. So here we can see that last year, actually around 9% of all biofuel production was using waste and residue feedstocks. This was mostly HVO and biodiesel using used cooking oil and animal fat. However, we also do a forecast for what we call novel advanced biofuels. So that's the little purple slice on the left-hand side graph. So these are the fuels that use waste and residue feedstocks, but that are currently in development. So an example here would be cellulosic ethanol or thermochemical fuels from gasification and pyrolysis. Now, we think these are important in the long term because these can tap into feedstocks such as agricultural residues, forestry residues, and municipal solid waste that have potentially a large availability and lower costs. However, when we look at these projects, we see that around half that we found are still at demonstration scale, and really only 1 in 5 announced projects is actually moving to construction. So by the end of the forecast, we see production being relatively low, between 3 to 4 billion liters, so around 2% at a maximum of total biofuel production. And most of that is in the United States, Europe, and India, where supportive policies for such fuels are in place. So now I'm going to pass to my colleague Francois, who's going to cover renewable heat.
Thank you, Farrell, and hello, everyone. So we have discussed so far electricity and transport. It is now time to say a word about heat, which is actually the largest energy end use. Heat accounts for half of global final energy consumption in 2018 and contributes 40% of global CO2 emissions. Half of global heat consumption is used for industrial processes, while the other half is used mostly in buildings, for space and water heating and cooking, and also marginally for agriculture. Today, heat supplies are dominated by fossil fuels, mostly coal and gas, with renewables meeting only 10% of the demand in 2018. So looking at the outlook period, renewable heat consumption expands 22% globally. This is a slightly upward revision from last year, yet this is a much slower growth than for electricity and transport. The expected development of renewable heat is slightly stronger in building than in industry, and China, the EU, India, and the US together account for 2/3 of the growth, as you can see in the left figure. But because global heat demand is expected to continue growing at the same time, the share of renewables reaches only 12% by 2024 from 10% in 2018. Just to put it bluntly, this projected deployment is not in line with global climate change targets. So greater ambition and stronger policy support are needed to ramp up the use of renewables for heat and as well to improve efficiency, energy efficiency, both in buildings and in industry. Now, taking a more detailed look by technology, what can we see? Well, globally, bioenergy, which is today the largest renewable heat source, it accounts for more than 2/3 of global renewable heat consumption, continues to lead growth. Most of the increase is expected to occur in industry, where penetration is already greater than in buildings. India is anticipated to almost catch up with Brazil as the largest industrial bioenergy consumer, thanks in particular to biogas use in sugar and ethanol industry. And in building, the EU is expected to be responsible for more than half of the increase, thanks to the deployment of wood chip and pellet stoves, as well as bioenergy use in district heating. Moving to solar thermal, well, solar thermal consumption is expected to expand almost 50% over the outlook period, despite a continuous decline in annual capacity addition over the last 5 years. China is by far the largest solar thermal consumer, and it is projected to remain the largest contributor to solar thermal growth over the outlook period, followed by the USA and the EU. Most of the increase in solar thermal is expected to result from the deployment of solar water in buildings. And another thing, here at the IEA, we also estimate the amount of electricity used for heat that can be attributed to renewable sources. So we do so by estimating electricity consumption for it and taking into account national shares of renewable sources in electricity generation. And what is interesting to note here is a substantial increase in renewable electricity used for heat. Which in absolute terms is almost equivalent to bioenergy expansion. As a result, renewable electricity is projected to account for 1/5 of global renewable heat consumption by 2024. And this growth in renewable electricity for heat results both from rising shares of renewable in electricity generation and from greater use of electricity for heat. So which of these two trends is the main driver? Well, if we analyze more in detail, we see that it varies across regions. This figure that you can see here shows for different regions how each factor contributes to the expansion of renewable electricity used for heat. We see that electrification of heat plays a significant role in India and China, partly due to the development of heat pumps, while in the EU and in the USA, the expansion of the share of renewable is the key reason for higher renewable electricity consumption for heat. This actually shows how the deployment of renewable in the electricity sector also has positive spillover effects on the heat sector. And in the time left, I will skip geothermal heat to focus on district heating. Today, district heating networks supply about 6% of heat consumption globally, most of it in China and Russia. So similar to what we did for electricity, we consider the fraction of heat supplied through district heating which comes from renewable sources. In 2018, this represented less than 8% of the energy used in district heating globally, with bioenergy making most of it. So over the outlook period, renewable district heat consumption is expected to expand 41%, and this growth is led by China, which hosts the largest and fastest growing district heating capacity worldwide, in particular in the northern urban heating area, where using alternative fuels such as bioenergy and waste in district network is part of the strategy to fight air pollution in our cities. While district heating offers an effective and economical way to harness renewables for heat, its current contribution remains limited. Yet, looking at countries such as Sweden, Denmark, or Finland, where district heating is well established, with renewables representing a significant share of energy supply, we see that district heating potential remains vastly unexploited globally. So there are opportunities for many countries to integrate higher share of renewable into existing networks, like for instance in China, Poland, or Russia, that you can see on the left of the graph. And also to deploy new infrastructure, like in the USA, in Germany, or in France, for instance, that you can see here on the bottom of the graph. Saving this opportunity will require active involvement from local authorities and the implementation of robust policy schemes. So this is it for heat, and I will now leave the floor to Jaime for a few concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Francois. So just a few concluding remarks, and we have a lot of questions which we will try to combine them to answer. So overall, solar PV and wind account for 70% of the global power capacity expansion in the next 5 years. This is impressive, but this also requires new policies, new approaches to integrating them. This year, we did an analysis on how many countries are basically in terms of their penetration of renewables in electricity are high or low. We actually found out that even at the end of our forecast, close to 100 countries will remain below 10%. So for those countries, maybe this will not be a huge challenge, but for the rest of the countries, the challenges start increasing. Distributed PV growth is led by commercial applications, as we said. It remains a huge potential, but the policies need to compromise between attracting investment, securing enough revenues for the grid, but also ensuring a fair allocation of grid costs for all customers so that non-PV customers don't pay additional grid costs compared to the PV owners. Biofuel production set to expand continuously. Asia leads the growth, driven by the enhancing security of supply. HV output increases, but we need more innovation for advanced biofuels in order to grow faster in the longer term. Renewable heat expansion is also led by bioenergy and renewable electricity. However, district heating's untapped potential remains, and it's a good and fast and in many places economic way of increasing the share of renewables in the heat system. Overall, government roles remain critical for the climate change fight and improving air quality and increasing energy access. We need policies addressing system integration, investment and policy risk, and obviously, as we saw, greater focus on transport, heat, and efficiency. On this note, I would like to conclude the presentation, and I would like to start by answering about 5 to 7 questions at the same time, because they're all related to the same topic. It asks about our methodology, forecast, and how do we do the forecast. We have a bottom-up approach. We actually do a forecast for electricity side, country by country, very detailed way for about 50 countries, and a less detailed way for the other 100 countries in the world. We forecast technology by technology, and country by country. We don't have regional aggregates. We go over the policies, drivers, and challenges again, country by country. And then we have two cases, as you saw. We have a main case, which looks at the existing policies and the cost situation and competitive situation and versus the auctions or feed-in tariffs, whatever in place, and assess the challenges against these drivers and basically decide how much capacity in a country that will come online. The capacity additions, as you saw in the figures, are done year on year, not in a cumulative manner, although we present sometimes that way. But we actually take into account already announced policy changes in certain years in order to reflect the forecast. This is overall our methodology. There's been questions about if do we compare ourselves based on our last year's forecast. We showed the figure, but there were other questions related to if we were pessimistic in our forecast last year. Yes, because of the policy changes as we described. Our 2018 development capacity additions were between our main case and accelerated case. We overestimated in our accelerated case and underestimated in the main case. This is only, by the way, for China solar PV, which actually resulted in significantly lower additions in China that many people were expecting. It was also reflected in our forecast, so we reflected this last year. As of this year, we changed the forecast and we improved our numbers based on the new announcements. The forecast doesn't take into account unannounced policies because we are looking at a very short term here. So we do not assume that X country will do another 10 gigawatt auction by that date. Although there were questions about the competitiveness of renewables, they are in line with the fossil fuels, but renewables have a significant upfront investment, so it will be very, very challenging for them to go directly to the spot market. So in order to achieve a relatively long-term contract, even at the lower price, they need this stable structure. Based on that, I would like to pass the floor to Yasmina to answer a question on Europe forecast revisions and Germany distributed PV. So the question is on that which segment leads the distributed PV in Germany. Would you like to start with that?
Sure. It's a good question. In Germany, the commercial segment leads the growth. We expect about 12 gigawatts of growth in the commercial segment, and about a little bit between 2 and 4 for the residential. And the main reason for that is that the economics tend to be better, or we expect the economics to be better for commercial. And that can be reflected just in looking at the 2018 growth too. It's commercial size that dominates the growth instead of residential. Right now, we're estimating the levelized cost of electricity generation for commercial to be between about $60 and $120 per megawatt hour, which is about a third less than, and for the commercial systems, which is about a third less than residential. Both of those benchmarked against a variable electricity price of about 300 USD per megawatt hour. So the levelized cost of generating electricity for commercial systems is about a third lower right now than residential. And then, as you mentioned earlier, because there's a better match for the commercial systems during the day versus the residential sector, then this economics tend to be better. So we expect more growth there.
For the European Union question, the question states that in 2018, these policies already announced. Did we include them? Did we not include them? What was why we revised up significantly this year?
That's actually a really good question, and it touches a lot on how we do the forecast. So just to repeat the question, can you repeat the words exactly, because I think it's really important.
The strong upward revision in the EU is due to the trends that were already foreseeable in 2018, when policy change was already in the pipeline. Why weren't these trends already factored in last year's report? Do you expect another upward revision next year?
Yeah, so I mean, I think those are really good questions, and I think it's important to, it picks, or it tends to how we do our forecast, and that generally speaking, policies have different stages, I would say, of incubation. Caroline might be able to describe this further, in that usually a policy is rumored to be discussed, there's rumors that a policy will be happening. Then there's a policy that's put into draft form. The gestation period from when that draft form then becomes put into law or implemented into law can be short, it can be long, and there can be several iterations of that draft over time. So between when something, I would say, maybe rumor is not the right word, but is being discussed and starts to have public knowledge, to when it's actually implemented, can be quite long, and there's various degrees, I'd say, of certainty in which we as analysts then will take into account of how that will actually affect the market. And that also depends on the technology and depends on the country. So for example, some countries can have quote unquote rumors or draft policies in place that if certain numbers are announced, we're relatively certain that what's put in that draft is actually, what's going to be implemented due to previous track records. Other markets, that's not necessarily the case, and you might have a lot of volatility between a certain draft and what's actually passed. And if there's some sort of uncertainty in terms of the political climate, like if one party, for example, in one country proposes a draft, but then we've seen that there's several elections or there's a different change in power over time, we don't necessarily, if it's in the policy is just in draft form, we might be a little bit more conservative between assuming that that policy necessarily would equal the exact quote unquote amounts in place when it's implemented. So that generally describes, I guess, the forecast in the sense that, and I can understand where the question also comes from, because there has been maybe some discussions or leanings towards certain European policies that we thought might happen over the next year, last year, but we tend to be slightly cautious due to those things, due to the elements that we spoke about earlier. So in the case of Germany, for example, let's just take Germany. Last year there was the coalition agreement where it was there's a proposal to announce extra utility scale auction. So it was 4 gigawatts per year. But because that was still just a proposal at the time, we said, okay, we'll take half because it signals that there's increased support. But we're not sure until it actually becomes, a promulgated law. And so this year with the Omnibus Energy Act, we're able to say that now, okay, 4 gigawatts per year. I'd say the same thing probably currently holds for the proposal to extend the cap on distributed PV. So prior to the Climate Act, there's discussions of whether or not they would actually extend support for distributed PV beyond 52 gigawatts. And so we can say that there has been either discussions behind closed doors or in publicly by certain industry associations, but it's our job to kind of be like, well, it's our job to report back to the community how certain we are that the current policy environment is actually giving that signal. And so that's kind of the difference between our main and our accelerated case, where we can say, okay, currently there's not a clear signal that support is going to be extended, but the accelerated case, we see that this if the support is extended, then we do see growth growing. And so right now, for example, we do have the climate plan that is proposing to extend the cap, and we decided this time to include that extension in our main case, whereas last year we were including it really only in our accelerated case. And so in the case of France, for example, the 10-year plan is currently in draft form. The amounts that they're proposing in the 10-year plan now are much higher than we anticipated last year. We didn't have access to those amounts of capacity they're planning on auctioning. In terms of Spain, for example, there were rumors, or we had assumed that the charges for commercial would be lightened or removed this year, but we did not anticipate that, for example, they would institute a new remuneration system for residential last year. So that's a new development for us. And 3 gigawatts per year is a little bit more, I'd say, firm than it was last year in terms of the additional auctions for Spain, because they released their new climate plan. And so, as mentioned earlier, as the incubation period or the steps of the policy become clear, or maybe move towards being implemented more, then we tend to assign more weight to them and move them into our main case. But again, the point of the main case is to say, here's where the market's at, here's where the policy's at, here's where the difference is between where we want to go or what could happen, and then reflect that back so that the quote-unquote difference between those two is the policy certainty. Sorry for the long response, but I think it's a really good question that kind of hits home about the difference between the main and accelerated case, these markets.
The next question is on renewables, transport, and electricity. So I will give that to Farah. The question is, it seems that most of the policies are directed towards biofuels production. Wouldn't COMBA advancements be of a key contribution for electrification of transport? What are the policies in this regard? This is renewable and backup power.
Yeah, so first of all, I'll just explain a little bit about how we get that renewable electricity in transport. So what we do is we look at the anticipated demand for electricity in transport, both from rail and both from road, so from developments in the fleet, developments in electric rail, and what that sums up to in terms of electricity consumption. And then we marry that up with the renewable share in all the different countries where this happens, and we get an overall number. So what we're not really forecasting here is individual projects which look to link a direct electricity generation, renewable electricity generation technology with offtake for transport. I'm sure these type of projects exist, but we're looking really here at demand from the grid. That's not to say in terms of policies, I mean, it's fair to say biofuels consumption is policy driven at the moment in the main. It's also fair to say EV uptake is largely policy driven as well. It's certainly in the road sector. So those policies could be investment subsidies for the purchase of an EV, or things like preferential access to parking or to certain transport lanes, and government intervention in extending the charging network. On the other hand, whether a country tends to support electrification or to support biofuels or both obviously depends on the drivers. So I mentioned, for example, supporting security of supply, and also supporting a big one for biofuels is the actual crop. So if you look at Brazil, you look at India, by supporting ethanol, they're also supporting their national sugar industry, which is the number 1 and 2 in the world. So the drivers around supporting biofuels or EVs are very diverse. In China, a big support for electrified road transport is to do with air quality and the zero air pollutant emissions at the point of use of the vehicle is a big driver. I mean, essentially, in the long term, we need both. So there's a very clear, in our longer term projections, huge scale up in the electric vehicle fleet. This is very true. But even by 2040 in our ambitious climate scenarios, unfortunately, there's still a lot of internal combustion engines on the road. So there'll still be a role for biofuels, and particularly a role for biofuels in these longer haul transport sectors, such as aviation, marine transport, road freight, where the prospects for electrification, potentially with innovation, we could get there, but at the moment, it's likely to be liquid hydrocarbon fuels still used in these.
We have another question on heat. There are actually 3. I'm going to combine them. The first one is that whether we include waste in our heat projections. Do you want to answer that?
Yes, so waste is partly counted as renewable and partly as non-renewable. The convention uses that half of the waste is considered renewable, waste otherwise not. It's what we call the biogenic fraction of waste, and this part is included in renewable source of district heating.
The next question is the district heating. Which technologies we include? What is the primary source of district heating?
And when it comes to the other sources, so bioenergy is included, solar thermal energy is included, also is very marginal. Most of the development in solar thermal for district heating is in Denmark right now. And other like heat pumps or geothermal energy for district heating is also taken into account. Basically, we consider all that is considered as renewable source used in district heating.
The other one, very quickly, what is the technology by the growth in the use of renewable electricity as primary energy for heat? I guess this question refers to how we calculate renewable electricity portion. It's basically we take the share of the renewables and then apply it to the European Union convention. I will say so. I hope this answers the question. There are a few questions on distributed PV policies, actually 5 of them that I see here. What is our suggestions? Which policies are implemented where and how? And what are the impacts on consumers? So overall, the losses of the distribution companies, even at the highest level, globally, is less than 1% of the utility retail business. So just to put things into the context. But this doesn't necessarily mean that this global number is very low for smaller companies serving smaller distribution areas. Of course, for those companies, such as smaller utilities serving some parts of California or Australia, where the penetration of rooftop PV is more than 50%,
obviously, in these cases, the losses for that specific utility will be much higher. But this doesn't necessarily mean that utilities will go bankrupt. This is not argued or said in the report. It means that they will have to change their business models to include in their services this kind of installations, energy efficiency, become a service company. On the other hand, the global policy trend is to move away from net metering, which basically creates the biggest losses in terms of the grid contribution and biggest savings on their bills. That's the most attractive one for the consumers. However, not that attractive for grid or the utilities. So most of the countries are moving away from net metering tariffs and introducing real-time self-consumption models, which is obviously better for grid integration as well, because it's a real-time match between supply and demand. In that sense, we will see probably more and more policies introduced on that one. But how do we solve the fairness between consumers, between PV and non-PV consumers? 3 people asked this question. This is $1 million question because this includes a lot of factors. We are not talking about here only a utility scale plant that is bidding to the wholesale market or having a contract. We are here talking about consumers. There are different ways that are implemented in multiple markets. The initial reaction of the regulators is to increase the fixed costs in their bill for everybody in all the retail bill players. Obviously, increasing the fixed part hits the poor consumers and affects energy efficiency policies badly, because regardless of they consume, they have to pay that fixed part. On the other hand, with the fixed part increase, the grid receives more money at a fixed level regardless of the decreasing self-consumption. Another policy that is implemented is to cap the exports to the grid to manage it better, or give an additional tax to only solar PV ratepayers, or give an additional tax to solar PV owners that self-consume. Another thing is to remunerate them on their self-consumption by deducting the distributed grid charges. So there are multiple ways. Somebody asked, what is the IEA's policy suggestion? We cannot give a global policy suggestion on this because this is very country specific, but indication that we see is that remunerating distributed PV at a real time and with a price which is value based, as we call, which means it's usually between retail and wholesale price based on how the distributed PV excess generation gives value to the system, is a general guideline. However, the design of the retail market to reflect these policies and reforms are very country specific, and it includes multiple social conditions that needs to be considered, not only at the country level and probably at sub-country level. Another question pertains to North America forecast for other countries than United States, Canada and Mexico. Our forecasts are revised down for both countries because of policy changes. For Canada, the policy and government change in Alberta and other provinces cutting back on the renewable auctions is an effect. And for Mexico, there's a new government who is proposing to change the auction scheme of the clean energy certificate, which we reflected in our forecast and revised down, especially in the short term, to reflect this policy change. Our time is almost over. Maybe we can accept one more question. I'm looking at if anything we have not answered. Obviously, we have 40 questions. We couldn't answer all of them. Maybe one to finish, one on bioenergy. Is the bioenergy forecast for generation of electricity are both electricity and thermal energy?
No, so I think what that slide referred to when the question came up was just capacity. So a lot of the initial discussion on the forecast is the capacities in gigawatts, etc. We also interpret what that means for each technology in terms of generation, because of course they all have different capacity factors. So then we reflect that as well. And then, as you see, we did different separate forecasts for heat, where we would pick up to bioenergy for thermal use and indirect use of bioenergy in district heating, and then, of course, the biofuels. So what that initial question you're referring to, what does bioenergy mean, on the slide where it was the forecast growth with all the different technologies, this is electrical capacity, not taking into account the thermal capacity.
One last question that I will answer is on India. The question, what are the administrative and policy challenges for rooftop solar in India? Most Indian states have actually net metering schemes on annual or monthly basis, which are actually, in theory, pretty attractive. However, the implementation of these net metering schemes remains a challenge because financially troubled discoms are basically, in this case, if people start installing rooftop PV and self-consuming, already the bill losses because of multiple reasons are very big in India. On top of that, if relatively good rate payers who are actually the party that can install PV are reducing their self-consumption, discoms are reluctant to give additional connection to rooftop PVs. Most of the growth in our forecast is driven by actually government schemes on government buildings, which actually a good solution because there's a lot of rooftop space that is available that can be used by the government buildings. But overall, our forecast is extremely cautious on India rooftop business because of these challenges that I mentioned. I would like to conclude the webinar with this answer. Thank you very much for all of you to attend our webinar. Slides and a recording of this webinar will be available and will be sent to you after this today in the evening, so you can basically ask questions. On the screen, we have additional. If you have additional questions and comments, we have our email address. You can email us and ask additional questions. All data is available upon purchase of this book in an Excel form, so you can actually access the data, and it's enough to go to the link on the presentation to basically buy the question. Thank you very much for your attention. We may do in the coming months a specific webinar on distributed PV. We haven't set the date yet, but we will inform everybody through various social media channels about that. Thank you very much and have a good morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are connected. Thank you.